On Tuesday night, Secretary Hillary Clinton became what everyone is calling the presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party. She has enough delegates now, pledged and superdelegates, to win the nomination, and everyone more or less assumes she's going to. It would take a rather dramatic event to change the course of those events, so of course anything is possible until the convention is over. On Thursday, Senator Sanders is going to meet with President Obama, and apparently President Obama, according to the punditry on television, and Secretary Clinton's message to Sanders is going to be more or less, we all have the same objectives. Really, we just have differences of opinion about how to achieve these objectives, but we're really on the same page, so it's time to unite the party to defeat Trump and win the presidency and so on. The problem with all of this is the difference between Sanders as a movement, and so far Sanders the individual, and President Obama and Secretary Clinton is more than just differences of opinion on how to get to the same objectives. President Obama and Secretary Clinton represent a section of the party which are known as the corporate Democrats. These include hedge fund people from Wall Street and Silicon Valley billionaires, and so on. In other words, a section of the billionaires are very closely allied with this political class that runs the Democratic Party. This does not include Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders raised his money from outside of these billionaires, and he's come closer to representing the interest of working people in the Democratic Party and outside than any candidate with any traction in a long time. So what does that mean? It means that, like everything else, we live in a class society, and the Democratic Party has classes and stratum whose interests unite and converge on certain issues and diverge very seriously on fundamental issues. It's just very rarely there's a candidate that actually is able to articulate those interests of ordinary people that are within the Democratic Party or vote for it. This time there was. But where will all this end up, and what's next for the movement that supported Bernie Sanders, many of whom understand this issue and do not want to simply be brought into what some people call the Borg, being the corporate Democratic Party. Now joining us to talk about all of this is Danny Glover. Danny's been knocking his brains out for weeks and weeks, campaigning for Bernie Sanders. Danny's joining us from San Francisco. Danny is an internationally renowned activist, director, and actor, as everybody knows. Films like Lethal Weapon, series and The Color Purple. He's a board member of the Real News Network. And as I said, he's been campaigning all over the country for Bernie Sanders. Thanks for joining us, Danny.
It's great. Thank you, Paul.
So first of all, let me just ask you, after weeks and weeks on the road and rally after rally, how's this feel the morning after California? The expectations were pretty high that Sanders might have another Michigan, another amazing victory. And Clinton won by, about 13 points or so. How you feeling?
Well, I don't want to say that it feels like having a hangover. I don't know what it means to be drunk and having a hangover. But I don't feel, I could say the news was tough, but I don't feel disappointed. I still think that we've made incredible inroads with this campaign, and certainly an understanding that it's just simply a campaign is the perhaps emerging of a movement, the emergence of a movement, but it still represents a campaign for presidency. The presidency. What we do as we move forward is critical. As you stated, we are certainly on the same page about defeating Donald Trump without a doubt. Most people within the Democratic Party and progressives are on that particular page. The question becomes after that, what are the platforms going to be? There's certainly issues around minimum wage. There's issues around one payer, health care. There are other issues around foreign policy and really domestic policies that certainly we have to deal with. We've always heard that certainly that Hillary Clinton has been a champion for women and for the middle class, but there's always a differentiation between what we consider the middle class and the working class of people who are working. poor, underpaid workers, unemployed workers, those people who are giving up on work. That's the working class. That's the bottom of the bottom. So the question becomes, is that how do we deal with those particular issues? I mean, Bernie explicitly said that we needed some sort of work project in terms of rebuilding the infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. How does that come into play in employing, training? How does education come into play with respect? Bernie, throughout the campaign, was consistent when he talked about public institutions. Public educational institutions should be free to students. Those are just a few of the questions, primarily, and the one that certainly concerns all of us, those who are climate experts and climate activists. What are we going to do about climate change? What about the new information revealed about fracking and the methane gas released by fracking? All those are things that we are still on the table, that there are a variety and a wide difference between what Bernie has been preaching all year and through this campaign and what Hillary Clinton and the Democratic Party ascribe to.
Yeah, well, they kind of do and don't, especially on even on issues like climate change. Sanders is proposing a carbon tax, which is combined with regulation. And as I understand it correctly, Secretary Clinton is more about cap and trade and some of the stuff that President Obama's been doing, but doesn't go nearly as far as scientists are talking about. This goes back to my basic point, is that the hierarchy of the Democratic Party really is part of this upper tier elite. The billionaires are closely aligned with them and fund their campaigns, and they depend on that funding. Sanders broke that mold. How does he navigate these waters where there's a certain amount of convergence of interest, as I say, like defeating Trump? There may be other kinds of issues, but there's a real divergence of issues. And so how does he manage to position himself as someone who will help defeat Trump, but not just be assimilated into the corporate Democratic Party?
Well, I think that's critical. What's done in terms of the platform committee, even though that's not binding once the candidate is elected to the office. But what happens there? What happens with the rules committee with respect to primaries and the spacing out of primaries? What happens in terms of the voting rights, the suppression of voters, and everything else? All those are real, and disenfranchisement of it. All of the real issues in terms of how we now stand and mobilize. And I think that the question still becomes, outside of Sanders, and we've always said, this is not about a personality, this is about a message. This is about an expression of those people who have been left out. And the numbers don't lie. I mean, we say that he has 45% of the delegates, a significant number, well over 10 million people who voted voted for him. So those are real leverage points that we can use in building a real movement. We yet to build this real movement. We've simply been engaged in trying to get him to the point of electing him as president. And so, and I think the onus still is on us. And what happens after? What about the networks that are need to be developed in terms of building a movement? What about the relationship that has to be developed? And how do we stay on point in terms of what those social justice movements are? We're talking about the prison industrial complex and certainly the broken justice system. How do we actually fix that? What does that look like when we fix it? We haven't even talked about political prisoners within this whole process, and the idea of their political prisoners here who need to be out of jail and need to be back in their communities and with their families. Those are still questions, I think, that we have to deal with.
I mean, this has to be in an organizational way. One would think this has to be done really now, this idea of converting this from simply a campaign to elect Sanders to something that goes beyond the convention, and I would think the fight at the convention is very much part of this. But there's issues like, for example, is there going to be a campaign to primary really progressive candidates in 2018? Is there even now starting the thought for primarying, assuming it really looks like this will be probably President Clinton, even now planning for what that campaign might look in 2020?
Yeah. What it looks like in 2020, how do we support progressive candidates on all levels, on local, state, and national levels, whether it's in the Senate or state assemblies or Congress, state congressmen, and National Congress, all those places where we need supporting mayors, supporting legislation on the state level and the local level. There's certainly and all the other movements that are happening. We cannot underestimate, as we see around the world, the resurgence of the right. We see it in Latin America, and we see it in other places in the world. And so we still have the right wing is still empowered in some sense. And they feel that even despite the Trump candidacy and the ludicrousy of his candidacy, that they have their foot, they have their imprint on what happens as well.
I mean, this is part of the point. This Hillary Clinton, some people try to talk about, as a progressive who wants to do these things incrementally, where Sanders wants to do the big idea, but they're essentially both progressives. But I think a lot of people don't really believe that Hillary is progressive. Her history suggests that on foreign policy, she's pretty close to neocons, and domestically, she's really in sort of the centrist, center-right, neoliberal kind of economics. So what you kind of have is the right and the far right contending. The other point, which I think is important, I don't know how much this is being talked about yet amongst the Sanders movement, but it looks like the Republican Party, the leadership, really is bailing on Trump. When Paul Ryan calls him a racist and then he supports him, then that support doesn't mean very much. It kind of made Ryan look like a fool, but I suppose tactically he had to frame it that way. But once you start calling your own candidate a racist, it doesn't sound like you're very serious about seeing him elected. Mike Murphy, who's a strategist for the Republican Party, we have a story about this on the Real News today. He essentially came out and said Republicans should just cede the presidential election. But part of that is what the Koch brothers already concluded, is focus on the down ticket, focus on making sure Congress stays in the hands of the Republicans and state legislatures stay in the hands of Republicans, which means that the Sanders movement would have to pivot rather quickly to get involved in some of these congressional and state legislature races. Otherwise, you actually wind up having a consolidation of the right at those levels, and which, even if Hillary Clinton had anything progressive she wanted to do, she's not going to be able to.
Well, that's exactly right. We see that, and we've seen that over the past decade of that, the entrenchment of the right wing, and certainly voter suppression and all those things have happened right at the state level, state and local level. And historically in this country, it is about what happens at the state and local level. That determines what happens to a great deal in terms of national policy as well. So the things that matter to people, there's certainly an hour minimum wage is something that matters really to people. That's going to be fought on a state by state, locale by locale space. That's where that struggle is going to be fought. And I think that's clear to be understood. That's something that basically people can get their arms around and get their hands around and get the movement around as well. When we talk about that, because we're talking about issues about homelessness, all those things take place on a local level. And it's imperative that we, as you say, have to retool at this particular point in time and look at that. Sanders and all the other organizations have to be mindful of what work needs to be done and what impact they can have on terms of changes the entire movement around, and getting right there on the state and local level.
All right, thanks for joining us, Danny.
All right, then.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.